Tonight, we are going to travel far beyond the world you know, past the noise of the present, past the worries of the day, and into a time when gold shaped the destiny of entire civilizations. A world where wealth was measured not in numbers, but in weight. A world ruled by kings whose power glowed like the metal they carried, and among them stood one man whose fortune was so extraordinary, so magnificent, that even today, historians whisper about its consequences. His name was Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, keeper of the Sahara's golden veins, and the man whose legendary pilgrimage reshaped economies, toppled markets, and left behind a trail of stories so bright that they blinded the world. But gold, even the purest gold, carries a shadow. And tonight, we will explore that shadow, slowly, softly, letting the story unfold like grains of desert sand drifting in the wind. So breathe slowly, let your shoulders drop, and allow your mind to travel with me to the ancient kingdom of Mali in the early 1300s, where the gold was real, the power was absolute, and the curse began. The land we now call West Africa looked very different 700 years ago. Vast plains, slow rivers, villages woven from mud and sun, and beneath the earth, a treasure that would connect continents: gold. Mali stood at the center of three worlds: the African interior, the Islamic trade routes, and the Mediterranean economy. Caravans traveled across the Sahara, long lines of camels swaying in the heat, their feet sinking softly into the endless sand. They carried ivory, salt, textiles, and above all, bars and nuggets of pure gold. For centuries, this trade flowed quietly, steadily, until one ruler stepped forward and changed everything. Mansa Musa, the 10th ruler of Mali, a man described as generous, wise, devout, and unimaginably rich. Some chroniclers estimated his wealth at more than $400 billion in today's value. Others said his gold reserves were so vast that even imagining them required a suspension of disbelief. But wealth alone was not his legacy. It was what he chose to do with it. In the year 1324, Mansa Musa decided to embark on a pilgrimage, a journey every Muslim who could afford it was expected to make, a journey to the holy city of Mecca. But Musa did not travel as a simple pilgrim. He traveled as a king, with an entourage so large that the world had never seen anything like it. Some accounts speak of 60,000 people. Others mention hundreds of camels, each carrying gold. Not coins, not dust, but solid gold bars. Enough gold to reshape economies and to unleash a pattern that would echo for generations. But before we follow him on that long road to Mecca, we must understand the world he was about to disrupt. A world that depended on gold, but couldn't control its flow. A world fragile enough that a single man's generosity could send it into chaos. The year was calm. The skies above Mali shimmered with dry heat, and Mansa Musa began to gather his caravan. Imagine the sound: soft footsteps in the dust, the quiet groans of camels kneeling under their loads, the murmur of attendants preparing supplies, the golden glint of bars being wrapped in cloth. There were servants, soldiers, scribes, heralds, scholars, and musicians. A moving city stretching farther than the eye could see. The chronicles tell us that Musa's caravan included 12,000 servants, each dressed in fine fabrics, 500 slaves carrying gold staffs, camels loaded with hundreds of pounds of gold each, and countless others serving, guarding, or guiding the journey. As they left the capital city of Niani, the dust rose behind them like a golden mist. They moved northeast toward the edge of the Sahara, toward the horizon where the sands meet the sky. The nights were cold, the days were slow, and the desert stretched before them like an endless sea. Caravans passed quietly. Traders bowed their heads as the emperor walked by, his presence glowing like the sun. But beneath the majesty, beneath the splendor, something else was forming. A distortion, a disruption, a shift in the delicate balance of gold and currency across every city the emperor would visit. No one knew it yet. Not Musa, not his attendants, not the merchants waiting on distant roads. But every step, every day, every bar of gold he carried was about to release a wave that would break economies open. And so the journey continued, across dunes that shimmered like gold themselves, toward Egypt, toward Cairo, toward the moment when the curse would begin. Cairo, in the 1300s, was one of the most vibrant cities on earth. Its markets overflowed with spices and silks. Its mosques shone with intricate patterns. Its scholars debated in quiet courtyards, and its economy beat like a living heart through the trade of gold. When word spread that a king from Mali was approaching with unimaginable wealth, curiosity filled the streets. Merchants whispered, officials prepared, and the people gathered to witness the arrival of the richest man they had ever heard of. When Musa entered Cairo, his caravan flowed behind him like a golden river. The city stopped, the people stared, and the legend began. The gifts he offered were not small tokens. He distributed gold with generosity, almost impossible to comprehend. He gave it to the poor, the merchants, the nobles, the sultans, the craftsmen. The poets' gold poured into Cairo like water from a broken dam. At first, it was a miracle. But within weeks, the price of gold collapsed. Its value tumbled, currencies weakened, and Cairo's economy, which had been stable, began to sway like a candle flame in the wind. The generosity of one man had triggered hyperinflation. Money lost its value. Markets spun, trade stuttered. And this is where the pattern appears. A pattern invisible to those who lived through it, but clear to us now. A pattern of abundance causing collapse. A pattern of wealth triggering weakness. A pattern that would repeat throughout history, again and again and again. Cairo, the jewel of the Nile, was not prepared for the river of gold that Mansa Musa brought. At first, people celebrated. Merchants raised their voices in praise. Poets wrote verses about the generosity of the king from the west, and children ran through the streets holding small nuggets of gold as if they were toys. But slowly, quietly, the imbalance began. Gold is powerful, but it is delicate. Its value depends on scarcity, on balance, on careful control. And Musa had not come to control. He had come to give. He spent freely, lavishly, openly. He gave gold to the poor. He paid musicians. He rewarded scholars. He gifted nobles. He purchased supplies in quantities Cairo had never seen. The value of gold began to fall, and with it, the value of money itself. Merchants who had been rich one week found their wealth shrinking the next. Prices soared as money became less stable. Grain cost more, cloth cost more, spices cost more, bread cost more. A city that had been prosperous now struggled to find equilibrium, all because of one visitor, one king, one pilgrimage that carried too much gold and too little restraint. Economists centuries later would describe this as one of the earliest documented cases of hyperinflation triggered by an individual. But Cairo in the 1300s had no such word, no such concept. They only had the consequences. The Sultan himself attempted to stabilize the currency by buying back gold at higher prices. trying to compensate for the oversupply. But the pattern had begun, and nothing could stop it. Gold had flooded the market, value dissolved, and the economy trembled like a flame in the desert wind. This was the first sign of the curse. After weeks in Cairo, Mansa Musa continued his pilgrimage, but the damage remained behind him. A shadow cast by generosity, a ripple that spread through marketplaces, through caravans, through households, through the very coins people held in their hands. As Musa's caravan traveled eastward toward Mecca, others traveled westward with news of the king's wealth. Stories grew. Some said he could refill the Nile with gold if he wished. Others claimed his wealth had no end. A few whispered that perhaps his gold was cursed, because nothing so abundant could exist without consequence. The desert does not move quickly, but stories do. And soon the entire Arabian Peninsula knew that a king from Mali was on the road, with gold enough to humble cities. The sand dunes shifted softly as the caravan moved. Nights fell cold. Stars shimmered silently. And every step they took deepened the imprint they left on the world. In the quiet, you can almost imagine the soft sounds of the journey, the slow breaths of camels, the murmur of guards, footsteps pressing into sand, the distant jingle of gold bars wrapped in cloth, a kingdom's wealth being carried on the back of a single pilgrimage, a king whose devotion was sincere, but whose influence was dangerously underestimated. And with every mile, the pattern continued, a pattern of abundance, a pattern of imbalance, a pattern invisible to those around him, but clear to us now. When Mansa Musa finally reached Mecca, the holy city was overwhelmed. Pilgrims from across the Islamic world stood in awe as the king from Mali arrived with his golden entourage. He donated it to the poor. He funded mosques. He supported scholars. He purchased supplies at inflated prices, prices inflated by his own giving. Merchants raised their prices simply because they knew Musa could afford them. What had happened in Cairo happened again, this time on a quieter scale. Inflation crept into the markets of Mecca. Value trembled once more, and the legend of Musa grew brighter and darker. At the same time, chroniclers wrote that no one had ever seen a pilgrim so generous, so wealthy, so unstoppable. But behind the admiration was an echo, a quiet hum, a shift. Gold had become too common in the places he visited, too abundant, too heavy, and economies built on careful control were not designed to absorb that abundance. From a distance, it looked like a miracle. Up close, it looked like imbalance, a pattern that would show itself many times throughout financial history. Too much, too fast, too freely. The curse was not in the gold. The curse was in the excess. And though Musa meant no harm, his gifts were changing the world. After completing the pilgrimage, Mansa Musa began the long journey back to Mali. But this time, something unusual happened. Gold was no longer enough. Markets had shifted. Currencies were unstable. So Musa, in an attempt to restore balance, began borrowing gold from merchants along the way. Borrowing? The richest man in the world. Borrowing gold. Not because he lacked wealth, but because he wanted to correct the imbalance he had created. But the pattern cannot be undone by retracing one's steps. Cairo, Mecca, and the cities between them had been marked. The flow of gold had carved new paths in the economic landscape, and economies do not forget such disruptions. As Musa approached Mali again, the stories had grown even bigger. Some said he was a prophet. Others said he commanded the desert. A few whispered again about the curse, that the gold he carried changed everything it touched. But the truth was more simple, more human, more universal. Gold, like all wealth, is powerful only when balanced. And imbalance has consequences, consequences that follow you, quietly, like a shadow in the desert. As Mansa Musa traveled back toward Mali, the desert felt different. The sands were the same. The dunes moved with the same slow patience. But the silence held a weight that hadn't been there before. His caravan, still massive, still shimmering with gold, no longer brought the same awe they had carried on the way to Mecca. Instead, there was a quiet reverence, a distance, a sense that what they carried was not just wealth, but consequence. There is a moment in every great economic shift when the pattern changes, but no one realizes it yet. For Mansa Musa, that moment had already passed. Cairo had changed. Mecca had changed. The markets along the roads had changed. Gold itself had changed. And yet, the desert remained calm, as if holding its breath while the world adjusted to the echoes of abundance. Musa remained generous. He continued giving gold wherever he traveled. But now, people accepted it with a mixture of gratitude and caution. They had seen what too much gold could do. Even the scholars traveling with Musa began to whisper about the nature of wealth, about balance, about the thin line between generosity and disruption. And beneath these quiet conversations, beneath the soft cracking of desert fires, beneath the stars that watched silently overhead, the pattern continued to unfold, invisible, powerful, inevitable. When Mansa Musa finally returned to Mali, the kingdom welcomed him with celebration and pride. His pilgrimage to Mecca had elevated Mali's status to new heights. Entire cities now recognized Mali as a center of wealth, scholarship, and power. The prestige of the pilgrimage brought scholars from the Islamic world to Musa's court: architects, astronomers, mathematicians, and poets. Among them was the famous architect al-Sahili, who would later design some of Mali's most iconic buildings. Musa began transforming his kingdom, building mosques, establishing schools, funding libraries, expanding trade routes, strengthening diplomatic relations. The city of Timbuktu grew into one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world, a place where manuscripts filled halls and scholars debated under the quiet glow of torchlight. Musa invested heavily in culture, education, and religion. His pilgrimage had unlocked connections that brought knowledge and innovation into the heart of West Africa. But while Mali prospered, the consequences of his generosity continued to ripple outward. Stories of his wealth had spread across continents. Maps were redrawn to place Mali at the center of global riches, and traders began seeking routes to reach the kingdom's gold. Interest grew, curiosity grew, and with curiosity came competition. The world's economic gaze shifted toward West Africa, a shift that would one day change the fate of the entire region. Inflation is a quiet force. It does not shout. It does not crash like a storm. It moves silently, slowly, spreading through markets like heat through metal. And the gold Mansa Musa had given away continued to move. For years after his pilgrimage, markets across North Africa remained unstable. The sudden abundance of gold had altered prices, shifted values, and reshaped trade. Scholars in Cairo recorded that it took more than 12 years for the economy to stabilize again. 12 years to recover from one man's generosity. This is the invisible pattern hidden beneath Musa's legend. A pattern we see again in financial bubbles, in speculative booms, in markets flooded with new wealth, whether oil, real estate, stocks, or cryptocurrency. Too much, too fast, too uncontrolled. The pattern repeats because the psychology behind it never changes. Economies rely on balance. And when abundance breaks that balance, even with the best intentions, the consequences spread quietly, like ripples on a still lake. Mansa Musa did not intend to disrupt an entire region. He intended to honor his faith, to show generosity, to uplift the poor. But wealth, when released without restraint, takes on a life of its own, and the world reacts. Legends often carry a hidden price. The stories of Mansa Musa's wealth captured imaginations across continents. Cartographers who had never visited Mali drew the emperor on their maps, sitting on a throne of gold, holding a golden orb, placed in a kingdom of shimmering prosperity. Europeans gazed at these maps and saw opportunity, saw wealth, saw land they believed overflowed with riches. The myth became larger than the truth. For centuries, explorers, traders, and empires looked toward West Africa with hunger. The idea of Mali's endless gold became a spark for expeditions, for economic ambition, and eventually for exploitation. Musa's pilgrimage had elevated his kingdom, but it had also drawn a dangerous level of attention. The pattern was now global. The wealth of Mali became too visible, too alluring, too irresistible to those searching for power. And in the shadows of this attention lay the beginnings of future conflict, not caused by Musa himself, but by the world's reaction to the legend he had created. A legend gilded with gold and stained with consequence. Back in Mali, the influence of Mansa Musa's journey was not only economic, it was intellectual. His pilgrimage had connected him to scholars across the Islamic world, and he invited many of them to return with him. Among those scholars was the architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a man of refined taste, deep knowledge, and a sense of design that blended art with spirituality. Under Musa's patronage, al-Sahili constructed some of Mali's most iconic structures: the Jingureber Mosque in Timbuktu, the royal buildings of Gao, learning centers that blended desert aesthetics with classical Islamic geometry. These structures were not just buildings, they were symbols, representations of Mali's new identity as a center of scholarship. Inside these halls, manuscripts filled shelves, written in Arabic, Berber, and the languages of West Africa. Texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, philosophy, and history. Students traveled for miles to study under scholars supported by the emperor. Timbuktu became a beacon of learning, a place where ideas flowed as freely as gold once had. This was the bright side of Musa's wealth, the part of the pattern that uplifted, enlightened, and inspired, the part history often forgets amid the glitter of gold. But while Mali flourished intellectually, the economic consequences of Musa's pilgrimage continued to ripple across regions far beyond his borders. In Cairo, records show gold prices slowly stabilizing, but never returning to their original balance. Some merchants who had prospered for decades lost everything during the inflationary wave. Others adapted, learning to navigate the new value of gold in a world suddenly saturated by it. In Mecca, small economic shifts were observed for years. The abundance Musa left behind circulated through markets, changing prices quietly, steadily. And across the Sahara, trade caravans adjusted their valuations. Gold from Mali was now perceived differently. The world had glimpsed a new scale of wealth, and markets could not forget. This is the deeper layer of the invisible pattern. An economy touched by abundance cannot return to its earlier scarcity. We see this today in modern financial cycles, oil booms, cryptocurrency spikes, housing bubbles, Silicon Valley surges. Every moment of excess creates waves that last longer than the moment itself. Mansa Musa was not a bubble, but his pilgrimage was a shock, a sudden expansion of wealth supply. And economies, ancient or modern, react to shock in predictable ways. That predictability, that repetition, that rhythm is the invisible pattern of financial history. Over time, as the years passed, the legend of Mansa Musa grew even larger. Merchants repeated tales of the king who traveled with rivers of gold. Poets embellished the stories with metaphors of suns and stars. Travelers added their own interpretations, each one more astonishing than the last. Maps produced in Europe showed Musa sitting on a golden throne, holding a golden orb, dressed in garments that glowed like fire. To those who created the maps, he was not just a king. He was a symbol of wealth beyond imagination, a dream of a land overflowing with riches. And dreams, especially dreams of gold, shaped decisions. For Europeans, these maps became motivation, a reason to explore, a reason to conquer, a reason to seek control over lands believed to hold endless wealth. The legend was no longer harmless. It had become a force, one that would outlive Musa and his descendants, a force made not of truth, but of perception. Gold has that power. It blinds, it dazzles, and it distorts. The world saw Musa's wealth and imagined entire empires of gold. But Mali's strength was not in endless mines. It was in trade, knowledge, and strategic control of resources. Still, the myth endured. And in that myth lay the seeds of future colonization, an unintended legacy born from abundance. As Mansa Musa grew older, his influence remained strong, but the weight of his legacy became clearer. He had elevated Mali to global recognition. He had funded a golden age of learning. He had expanded trade, strengthened alliances, and reshaped the identity of an entire region. But he had also unleashed a wave of economic disruption that lingered for years, and he had drawn the hungry eyes of the world toward West Africa. The pattern was nearly complete. Musa passed the throne to his son, Magan, but successors rarely carry the same strength as the architect of greatness. Mali remained wealthy, but the unity that Musa had shaped began to soften after his death. Trade routes shifted, rival kingdoms grew stronger, and the attention he had attracted from abroad would, in time, become a threat. But in his final years, Musa could not have known how far-reaching his influence would be. He could not have predicted the centuries of conflict that would later erupt over West Africa's resources, nor could he have foreseen how European exploration would transform the continent. He only knew that he had fulfilled his duty, his faith, his legacy, and as the twilight of his life settled, the desert winds carried whispers of the king whose gold had changed the world.
After Mansa Musa's death, the kingdom of Mali stood at a crossroads. The empire was still vast, its mines still rich, its scholars still writing in cool rooms lined with manuscripts. But without Musa's steady hand, the unity he had maintained began to loosen. Great empires rarely collapse suddenly. They fade, slowly, quietly, the way a candle dims before the flame surrenders to darkness. Trade routes that had once flowed smoothly through Mali's borders began to shift. Some merchants chose new paths, some caravans traveled farther north, and others were lured by competing powers emerging beyond the horizon. The wealth of Mali had always been tied to the movement of people, to trade, to diplomacy, and now the pattern changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the kingdom felt the weight of maintaining the greatness that Musa had built. It is one thing to rise to extraordinary heights. It is another to remain there. The scholars in Timbuktu continued their work. The mosques built under Musa's rule continued to echo with prayers and knowledge. But the world beyond Mali was moving, rewriting itself, reshaping the balance of power. And deep beneath those movements, beneath the shifting sands, beneath the slow turning of empires, the invisible pattern continued. Long after Musa's pilgrimage, stories of his wealth spread across continents. Arab chroniclers wrote about his generosity. European merchants spoke of his riches with wide eyes and eager voices, and mapmakers, especially in Europe, began depicting Mali as a land of pure gold. One famous map, the Catalan Atlas of 1375, shows Mansa Musa as a golden monarch, crowned, seated, holding a shining orb of gold in his hand. For Europeans, this was not merely artwork, it was a promise, a whisper that somewhere in the world there existed a kingdom overflowing with wealth, waiting to be found or taken. Ideas like this have power. They linger in the minds of explorers. They shape ambitions. They plant seeds that can grow into conquest. The myth of Mali's infinite gold was no longer a story. It was fuel. Fuel for expeditions, for colonial dreams, for the hunger of foreign powers seeking fortune far from their shores. This was the shadow of Musa's legend. Admiration mixed with greed, respect mixed with desire, a balance that rarely ends well. Mansa Musa's story carries one of the most fascinating paradoxes in financial history. He was generous beyond measure, wise in many decisions, and committed to uplifting his kingdom. Yet the very act that elevated Mali's prestige also destabilized entire regions. This paradox reveals a timeless truth. Wealth, when concentrated, can build. When released too quickly, it can break. Think of it as water. A steady flow nourishes, a flood destroys. The gold Musa shared had been gathered over generations. It represented the gradual accumulation of Mali's economic power. But in a single journey, a single pilgrimage, a single act of devotion, he released so much that markets lost balance. The value of currency depends on trust, on perception, on scarcity. And scarcity was the first casualty of Musa's generosity. The pattern is easy to see now. We see it again in modern eras, when oil is discovered and a sudden boom reshapes a nation, when real estate prices surge and collapse, when cryptocurrency rises and crashes, when speculative bubbles inflate faster than the economy can bear. Too much wealth in too little time creates distortion. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was not greed-driven, not reckless, not careless. It was faithful, spiritual, generous. But even good intentions cannot alter the mathematics of economics. The invisible pattern follows its own logic. Quiet, predictable, inevitable. As Mali continued into the late 1300s, new forces emerged beyond its borders. The Songhai Empire began to rise. Rival powers competed for control over trade routes. The Sahara shifted as new alliances formed. And across the Mediterranean, Europe's hunger for gold and spices and exploration grew stronger. By the 1400s, Portuguese ships began exploring West Africa's coast. Their maps, their motivations, their ambitions were all influenced in part by the legends of Mali's wealth. The myth crafted by chroniclers, exaggerated by merchants, and immortalized by cartographers created a target. Not immediately, not violently, but slowly, inevitably. Just as inflation had been an unintended consequence of Musa's generosity, so too was the attention that would one day lead to European expansion into West Africa. This too belongs to the pattern. Actions creating ripples, ripples creating waves, waves creating change. And through it all, the gold remained silent. Gold does not care how it affects the world, but people do, and people shape history with their choices. Empires rarely fall because of one moment. They fall because of 1,000 quiet shifts, small cracks that widen over time, changes so subtle that those living through them barely notice. Mali was no exception. After the brilliance of Mansa Musa's reign, the kingdom entered a period of gentle decline. Not a collapse, not a catastrophe, just a soft unraveling. Trade routes that once flowed through Mali slowly drifted toward rising powers. Rivals like Songhai grew more ambitious, and neighboring regions sought greater control over the precious gold that had once fueled Mali's greatness. In some ways, Musa's wealth had worked like gravity. It had pulled the world's attention toward Mali, but once that attention arrived, it became difficult to escape. Greatness creates expectations, and expectations create pressure. The invisible pattern was shifting again, a reminder that empires rise on the balance of wealth and power, but decline when that balance fades. Long after Musa's life ended, the shock waves of his pilgrimage continued to shape the region. Inflation in Cairo took more than a decade to stabilize. Trade dynamics were permanently altered, and the myth of West Africa's unlimited gold had taken deep root in the imagination of distant continents. The Portuguese in the 1400s sailed closer to the coast with growing curiosity. Their explorers recorded stories from local traders, stories of a king who once gave so much gold away that it ruined the markets of North Africa. To European ears, this was not a cautionary tale. It was an invitation to explore, to discover, to take. And quietly, the age of exploration moved one step closer. It is one of history's most delicate ironies, a gesture of generosity intended to honor faith and uplift people, unintentionally contributed to the beginning of a shift that would echo through centuries. This is not blame, it is pattern, a reminder that history is shaped not only by intentions, but by consequences. Consequences that bend and twist through time in ways no one can predict. As the decades passed, the gold mines of Mali continued to produce wealth, but the world around the kingdom changed. Trade routes that had once been steady were disrupted by political conflict and shifting alliances. The Sahara, always challenging, became even more difficult as rival states tried to control its pathways. The rise of Songhai challenged Mali's influence, and internal divisions further weakened the stability of the empire. Meanwhile, stories of Musa's pilgrimage transformed into myths, then into distant echoes, and eventually into romanticized legends told far from West Africa. The real Mali, its libraries, its scholars, its complexity, became overshadowed by the shimmering image of a kingdom of gold. And as European powers began expanding further along the West African coast, their perception was shaped more by legend than reality. They did not seek a nuanced empire, they sought treasure. This misunderstanding, this myth of endless gold, would influence explorers, merchants, and empire builders for centuries. And it all began with a pilgrimage, a journey of faith that became a journey of unintended transformation. By the time the 1400s arrived, Mali was still powerful, still influential, still respected. But the spark of the golden era had dimmed. The learning centers of Timbuktu remained bright with scholarship. The mosques built under Musa still echoed with prayer, and the manuscript culture continued to thrive. But cracks had begun to spread. The succession after Musa was unstable. Rivalries grew. Trade shifted northward. Regional powers sought independence. The empire that had once glowed under Musa's guidance was now fighting to maintain its borders, its influence, its identity. This is the quiet tragedy of great empires. Their greatest moments often sow the seeds of future complexity. Not because greatness is dangerous, but because it is difficult to sustain. Mansa Musa had lifted Mali to heights few kingdoms in history have ever reached. But heights are lonely places, and the world below is always shifting. As Mali drifted into its later years, one city remained a shining beacon of the empire's legacy: Timbuktu. Even as political power weakened, Timbuktu kept its brilliance through knowledge. Caravans still arrived, carrying salt, ivory, textiles, books, and ideas. Students from across West Africa came to learn in its madrasas. Scholars copied manuscripts under dim lanterns. Libraries grew, filling quiet rooms with the scent of parchment and ink. Timbuktu was more than a city. It was a sanctuary of wisdom, a place where the world could be understood through the steady rhythm of study and reflection. And even though Mansa Musa was long gone, his influence lived on in every page, every lesson, every whispered debate over astronomy, medicine, law, and philosophy. This was the part of his legacy that endured, not the gold that reshaped markets, but the knowledge that reshaped minds. Knowledge, the most valuable treasure of all. While Mali held on to its legacy, a new force was rising to the east: Songhai. A kingdom once ruled by Mali, now gathering strength, unity, and ambition. Under leaders like Sunni Ali and Askia Mohammed, Songhai expanded rapidly, claiming trade routes, absorbing rival states, and slowly overtaking the influence Mali had once held. The transition was not explosive, it was gradual, a shifting of tides. The world that Musa had shaped was changing. Songhai did not seek to erase Mali's legacy, but empires, by their nature, often build their future by standing on the foundations of those that came before. The trade routes that made Mali wealthy now fed Songhai. The scholars in Timbuktu continued their work under new rulers, and the gold mines that once symbolized Mali's power became part of Songhai's influence. This is the cycle of history. One empire rises, another shines, another takes its place. The invisible pattern continues. By the late 1500s, Mali had diminished from a vast, powerful empire to a small kingdom surrounded by stronger rivals. There was no dramatic fall, no single moment that marked its end. It simply faded, piece by piece, province by province, trade route by trade route. And in that quiet dissolution, there is a strange kind of beauty, an understanding that greatness does not need a tragic finale. Sometimes it just needs a peaceful exit. But even as Mali faded politically, its story refused to disappear. Travelers still told tales of a king who crossed the desert with so much gold that he changed the economy of nations. Scholars continued writing about Mali's intellectual heritage. Libraries preserved the manuscripts copied during the Golden Era, and maps, those early European maps, kept the image of a golden king alive for centuries. Empires may fade, but stories endure, especially stories made of gold. As we step back and look at the full picture of Mansa Musa's life, his wealth, his journey, and his legacy, a deeper pattern emerges. Not a story about riches, not even a story about power, but a story about consequences. Every action, no matter how good, how generous, how spiritual, creates ripples. And those ripples move across time in unexpected ways. Mansa Musa strengthened Mali, but destabilized foreign markets. He elevated Timbuktu, but attracted unwanted attention from distant empires. He spread wealth, but altered economic patterns that lasted decades. And none of this came from malice. It came from abundance, from devotion, from generosity. His story teaches us that wealth is not static. It is a force that shapes the world through every movement, every decision, every surge, and every scarcity. The invisible pattern is not about gold. It is about the way human beings respond to it. And that pattern is as ancient as it is modern. By the time Europe entered the age of exploration, the legend of Mansa Musa had already traveled far. It lived in old manuscripts, in merchants' stories, in maps decorated with golden imagery. And even though Mali was no longer the empire it once had been, the myth remained strong. Explorers did not sail in search of Mali specifically, but they sailed because they believed there were kingdoms like it, lands filled with wealth waiting to be found. The shadow of Musa's pilgrimage extended into the oceans, onto ships, and into the minds of sailors and monarchs planning expeditions. The world changed because of a journey that took place centuries earlier, a journey of faith that set in motion a series of events too vast to fully comprehend. And that is the essence of the invisible pattern. Small actions leading to great shifts, unseen forces reshaping history, moments of generosity creating waves that travel farther than anyone could imagine. When we look back now, across centuries of shifting sands, across the rise and fall of empires and kingdoms, there is a quiet truth at the center of it all. Mansa Musa's footsteps have long faded from the Sahara. His caravans are no longer seen glimmering in the heat. The gold he carried has changed hands countless times, but his impact remains, not in the physical world, not in monuments, not even in the gold that sparked so many stories, but in the silence that follows his legacy. Silence where scholars reflect on the lessons of unintended consequence. Silence where historians trace the delicate threads of economic shifts. Silence where travelers imagine the shimmering dunes that once bore witness to a king's extraordinary journey. History often leaves noise, battles, conflicts, declarations. Mansa Musa left something else, a silence filled with reflection, with wonder, with the soft understanding that a single act of generosity can echo far beyond its moment. The story of Mansa Musa forces us to confront a profound paradox. Wealth can be a blessing and a burden. It can lift people out of obscurity, expand knowledge, create beauty. But it can also distort markets, invite envy, and reshape the structure of entire regions. Musa never intended to destabilize economies. He never sought to trigger inflation in Cairo. He never imagined his pilgrimage would inspire foreign explorers centuries later. He simply acted as a king who wished to honor his faith and share his fortune. But abundance moves through the world differently than intention. It spreads, it magnifies, it transforms. This is the invisible pattern at its purest. Power creates ripples. Wealth creates waves. Actions create histories, even when those histories are written long after the actor has left the stage. From ancient Mali to the modern global economy, the lessons of Musa's journey reappear in countless forms. Sudden markets flooded with new resources, currencies destabilized by unexpected shocks, investors chasing myths of wealth, nations reshaped by the perception of opportunity. We see it in the oil booms of the Middle East, the dot-com bubble, the rise and fall of cryptocurrencies, the surges in real estate markets, the speculative frenzies that come and go like tides. The pattern does not change, only the players do. And just as the people of Cairo felt the impact of Musa's gold, today's economies feel the impact of the decisions made by corporations, political leaders, and financial systems. The story of Musa is not ancient history. It is a mirror, reflecting our world back at us, quietly reminding us that abundance is both powerful and delicate, and that the invisible pattern is always present beneath the surface. Today, when we speak of Mansa Musa, we often describe him as the richest man who ever lived. But richness is not the true heart of his story. His legacy is not gold. It is vision, faith, generosity, and the pursuit of knowledge. He built mosques that still stand. He funded scholars whose manuscripts still survive. He strengthened trade routes that shaped West Africa for generations. And he left behind a legend that continues to inspire awe 7 centuries later. Not because of his gold, but because of the idea that a single person can change the world without raising a sword, without conquering nations, without seeking glory, simply by walking a path of devotion and sharing what he had. In a world driven by wealth, his story is a quiet reminder that true legacy is measured not in riches, but in impact.
And so, our journey ends. Across the desert, through ancient cities, between the pillars of knowledge, and into the heart of a king who carried enough gold to dazzle the world. We have followed his footsteps through shifting sands. We have watched the ripples of his generosity move through time. We have witnessed the way a single life can shape nations, economies, and futures. As you rest now in the quiet darkness, feel the calm of the Sahara at night, the soft wind moving slowly across endless dunes, the distant glow of caravan fires, the silent rhythm of a world at peace. Let the story fade into stillness. Let the weight of gold melt into silence. Let your mind drift like sand carried by desert wind. And remember, even in the vastness of history, you are part of the pattern too. A small movement, a quiet ripple, a gentle step that carries meaning far beyond the moment. This is the invisible pattern. And now you may rest.